All right, so as Colin mentioned, I've been an entrepreneur for quite some time now. I've been an entrepreneur for over a decade, and throughout that time, I've built dozens of products. Now, while all my ideas started out as awesome ideas, not all of them went on to become awesome products or awesome business models, which I'm sure a number of you here can appreciate. Now, sure, like anyone else, I wanted to see more success than failure. I wanted more of my products to get somewhere. Some of them did, not all of them. But I was prepared for the odds of success, the dismal odds of success we talk about in startups. I knew that good ideas are rare and hard to find, so I was ready for the search process. You have to go through a lot of stuff that doesn't work before you actually find the few ones that actually do work. So that was okay. I was actually ready for that search. What I wasn't prepared for was the cycle time between those searches. At the time, I was averaging about a year and a half to 2 years between my ideas. So this was the time from when I had the initial spark of inspiration to the point when I knew this idea was going to work or not to kind of move on to other things. And that was just frankly too long. So I knew that I had more ideas than time, and at that point, this became a personal mantra of mine. So I knew I had more ideas. I had lots of things that I wanted to test, not enough resources, not enough time. I didn't have a magic time machine where I could get younger. So I knew that there were only finite chances to kind of make a difference. And so I began searching for better and faster ways to vet our ideas, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So the first place that I went was trying to understand product failure. So I went and I looked at lists, which some of you have probably done, and these are some of the things that came up. So people will say the number one reason why products fail is running out of funding or not having funding to begin with. And you can go down this list, and I'm sure a lot of you will nod your heads because they make sense. But when I looked at that list, unfortunately, none of these things were actionable because I could show you counterexamples of all of these instances. I found companies that were bootstrapped and became really big and never raised any funding. I found other companies that were well-funded and they still cratered. So that was not something you could kind of take to heart. Funding did not correlate always with success. So while this was a nice list, which you can kind of go and look online, it wasn't all that actionable. So I went elsewhere. I began to kind of introspectively study how I had been building products and why did all my ideas start out this way and why didn't they end up where they need to be. And I began talking to other entrepreneurs, both big and small, successful and not, and I saw this repeating pattern repeat itself. And that is that when we, the entrepreneur, have an idea, we have this kind of spark of inspiration, and we do one of two things. The first thing we typically try to do is go build out our solution. So we lock ourselves up in this metaphorical garage, and we start pounding away on product. At some point, we end up looking like that picture at the end because things always take longer than we expect. We always think it's going to be a quick prototype we put out there, but they always take longer, and so we surface, and then we go looking for other resources. We go looking for stakeholders, we go looking for team members, and we often get this big fat rejection because people cannot see what we see. So the solution that we have in our mind is not finished yet, and people can't connect the dots, and we get really frustrated. What I've learned is that this is a backwards approach. So this approach used to work back in the day when things were really expensive to build, but the world has changed, and I'll talk about this quite a bit more. But the reason it's backwards is that when we lead with solutions, as I said, people can't see what we see, and the investors, the stakeholders, don't really care about your solution. They really don't. They want to see the business model story. They want to see the traction story. So the way I define traction, I'll give you a better definition a bit later, but traction kind of at a very high level is evidence that somebody other than yourself, your team, maybe your mom, cares about this idea. It has to be something that ideally has interest from customers. So there needs to be existing customers or a pipeline of customers that you have in the works. Without that, it's a very hard sell. So if you take your half-finished product and now go looking for customers, that often doesn't go any easier either. Because at this point, sometimes having a half-finished product is worse than having no product at all. Because you're showing them something that, again, has faults, obvious faults. If I ask you to enter this test flight and take you to the moon, a lot of you will be very reluctant because you don't quite know if this thing will explode in 12 seconds. So that's, again, where we ask our customers to take this leap of faith with us, and it's not fair to them, and it doesn't really get the point across. So at this point, what most people end up doing is throwing their hands up in the air because it's a bit of a catch-22. You've got this half-finished product, no one will give you the resources to finish it, and customers won't even take the bet on you yet. So where do you go from here? And so that's why I often will say that this build or solution-first approach or an investor-first approach is often backwards, and we do have kind of a different way. In the lean startup methodology, we encourage people to start elsewhere. I know many of you in the room already have products. It doesn't mean that you can go back and fix some of these things, and I'm happy to answer some of those in the questions. But I'll give you a glimpse of what are some of the core problems that we try to address using the lean approach, and some approaches for how to get over those pitfalls, and then happy to kind of get very tactical. I'll share some case studies with you, and would love to open up for questions and have you kind of share some of your obstacles or challenges or objections to any of this stuff. Okay, so in my studies, as I began to look and see what were the reasons for failure, the number one reason that I found was a very simple thing, and that was simply that we were building the wrong product. So we spend all this time, money, and effort building something that ultimately nobody wants or not enough people want, and we need to stop doing that. And there are ways to kind of de-risk that right from the beginning, which we'll get to. But first of all, why does this happen? Why do we entrepreneurs go and build things that nobody wants? Because that wasn't the goal to begin with. And I put the blame on our shoulders. So I've been an entrepreneur, and so I can take the blame, and I think a number of you will probably agree with this, is that when we see our idea, the thing that comes most clearly to us is the solution box. So a lot of us will observe a problem out in the market, and then we quickly think we have a solution, and we spend every waking hour of the day trying to build that solution to life. I call that the innovator's bias. You can call it the entrepreneurial bias or the maker bias, and that is just a fact. It's something that I've seen over and over again, but it's also one of the reasons why we end up focusing on the wrong things at the wrong time. This is where I make a distinction between invention and innovation. It's not my distinction, but it's one that I think makes the point in a different way, and that is that when we think of invention is important, invention is necessary. That's when we find a new way of doing things. But a new way of doing things does not automatically turn into innovation, which works at the business model level. So there are more pieces to the jigsaw puzzle that have to come together simultaneously to make that business model work. So I'm not saying do not invent, but I'm saying while you're inventing, think of the business model. So I come from a product background myself, have been a software technical founder for many years, and still am. And the thing that I began to realize is that the business model is a product just like anything else that you build. And you can apply the same principles to systematically building a business model as you would to building any technical product. And I'll illustrate that here with some principles. This, by the way, was the first epiphany that I had that led to the writing of the first book, Running Lean, which I actually wrote as a side project. So now I'm a full-time author, speaker, but I still build software. But I wrote this kind of as a part-time project because it was more about taking some of these learnings that I'm sharing with you and first writing a blog and then turning that into a book, which was rather accidental, but that's another story. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the details. Maybe actually with a show of hands, anyone here familiar with the Running Lean book? Okay, a few hands. Anyone here read Eric Ries's Lean Startup book? Okay, about the same hands, okay. So it's always good to get a sense of how much prior lean or lean startup knowledge people are coming in with. So these are the high-level meta principles that I'm going to walk you here through today, and then we'll apply them to some quick case studies so you get a sense of what they are. Rather than doing it this way, I'll kind of illustrate that with a few more visuals. So the first principle here is one of documenting your plan A. And this one is very important. Now, studies have shown that an idea does not go as per plan. It actually gets derailed very, very quickly. So that's why I call it a plan A, because you are going to eventually get to a plan B or a C or a Z to make the idea work, but you have to start by drawing some line in the sand. And the reason that is so important is because we entrepreneurs are especially gifted with post-rationalization. We can look at anything that's happening out there, and we have a reason for why that thing is happening. So if you launch your product in the summer months and it's not selling, it's obvious it's because everyone's on holidays. No one's buying at that point. If you wait a little bit till the fall when they're coming back, they could still not be in the buying mood because they just got back from holidays, or their kids might be going back to school. Then if you live in the US, where I live, there's the trifecta. You have Halloween and Thanksgiving and then Christmas, and so everyone's in the holiday spirits at that point, so nobody may be buying your product. So by that logic, I can pick any month of the year. I can go on for the whole year. I can pick any month of the year and come up with reasons why my product isn't selling, and that's not what we want to do. So we want to be a lot more empirical in this approach. We have to draw lines in the sand, and we have to make predictions taking into account things like seasonality and hold ourselves accountable, which is what a lot of this process is ultimately about. Now, we have a way of doing this. So in the past, we used to use business plan, and some people in the present still use business plans. Maybe again, show of hands, how many of you here have written a business plan before? Okay, and keep your hands up if you enjoy that process. So, okay, this is a room of entrepreneurs, and sometimes I do see a few hands up in the air. So again, the business plan is something that is kind of required in some instances, but again, not a very pleasurable thing to do. But the intent is very sound. So the business plan was really intended to get the idea out of the entrepreneur's head and prevent them from coming in and saying, look, I'm going to go build this, and so give me money. So you need to do the business plan to kind of tell a more cohesive story. The issue, though, is that the world has changed. So it used to be that things were very expensive to build in the past. So an investor needed to do their due diligence. They needed to make sure that you were really thinking hard about this business plan. Even though many investors, even back then, knew that the plan would change very rapidly, they still wanted you to think critically about what you were presenting to them. So it became a bit of a barrier to entry, you may call it. But the world is different now. If we fundamentally ask ourselves, what is it that entrepreneurs and investors both want, it's not the business plan. Even when I've had a room full of investors in the room, few people do enjoy reading those plans, I will admit, but the majority of them do not, because they don't really want the business plan. They want the output of a working business plan, which is something like this. So this is ultimately what both entrepreneurs and investors want. They want to see the hockey stick curve, because when that curve starts to take off, it signals that good things are happening. So I don't care who the investor is. If I walk into their office with a curve that's beginning to look something like this, I'm going to create a Pavlovian response where they're going to sit me down and want to understand what I'm doing. They want to understand my idea better. So this is really what we want to get to. It's not really the business plan, but we can't get to that without doing some planning. So the no plan alternative, which unfortunately is what I see more often nowadays, is not any better. Because when we have the no plan approach, we fall into that post-rationalization trap. So without a plan, it's very easy to change your mind every single day, and that doesn't get you anywhere because you're always kind of spinning wheels. So you do have to have some planning, and so that's why in more recent years, we have this introduction of the business model versus the business plan. So the problem that I have with the business plan is, again, not so much the planning, because I think that's very important. And this is coming from someone who has not written very many business plans. So I was forced to write my business plans. I didn't enjoy the process. But now that I use business models, I appreciate the issues that it brings to life that I don't take the time to think of early on that I should. So the problem with the business plan, again, is that you create this big document. You spend several weeks, maybe months of your life creating this pretty document that at the end of the day, nobody takes the requisite time to read and give you the right kind of feedback. So at this stage, what you need most is a conversation. You need to be able to go to someone and share your idea, not just from a solution perspective, but the whole business model perspective, and get feedback. And the business plan fails to do that. That's been my experience. And so the alternative is a one-page business model. And I'll show you a picture of what something like that might look like. It's essentially a condensed down version of a business plan that fits on a single page. So unlike the business plan, it doesn't take you as long. It's a lot more concise. It's a lot more portable. But the key part here is that it creates a conversation. It looks something like this. So it's not more than this. It's just, it needs to fit on a single slide. It needs to be a single page. This is the lean canvas business model format that I created it's a derived work off of Alex Osterwalder's business model canvas that I'll put up here in a second. Some of you might have seen that, but I'll talk about this one a bit. So if you have written a business plan, you can quickly recognize some of these boxes here. There's a box for your customers, so you have to talk about who your customers are. On the left-hand side, you talk about what problems you're solving. You talk about how you solve those problems with your solution. What is your value proposition? How do you go to market? What's your cost structure, revenue streams? You can describe all of this in a single page, and you don't have to do anything more than that to get your idea out there. So unlike a business plan, it doesn't take you 20 weeks, but rather it takes you 20 minutes if you kind of have some practice creating one of these things. But more importantly, as I said, I put one of these in front of someone, and they can't help but have an opinion. And that creates a conversation, which is where true success lies. Even if someone is vehemently disagreeing with something on my canvas, that's great because it goes into the second part of the methodology, which I'll talk about here in a second. The thing to kind of internalize with this is that these blocks on here are really building blocks. I draw the analogy of them being a lot like Lego pieces. And if you've played with Lego, we know we can build very simple models like this one. We can use those same fundamental building blocks to build more elaborate models like this one. And we can do the same thing with tools like the Lean Canvas. You don't have to go into a bigger document to describe a more complex model. We can describe simple business models using this. We can also describe Facebook-type marketplace, multi-sided models, Airbnb-type models using this. So you don't have to go kind of to other tools to do that. So I promised the reference here. So this is the business model canvas. Anyone can use the business model canvas or familiar with it? So this is the business model canvas. I made some changes in there. I'm not going to talk about the differences, but happy to talk about that again if people have specific questions. My goal wasn't trying to improve the business model canvas, but really coming at it from a different paradigm. I found the business model canvas had boxes like key resources, key activities. I was an entrepreneur starting something new. I didn't have any of those things. I was going to acquire those things in the future, so I didn't feel like I could fill those boxes at that point in time. And so to me, the business model canvas was a better fit for more established companies. But if you were starting up, if you were in the earlier stages, I felt it was much more critical to start with fundamentals. So who are your customers? What problems are you solving? And how are you solving those problems? It was a customer problem solution paradigm versus kind of the business model from a strategic sense type of paradigm. At the end of the day, I would say that either of these are better than the alternatives. So the alternatives being the 60-page business plan or the no plan. So if you have a preference for one or have never seen either, take a stab at either one or actually create both, because for the same amount of time, if you spend an hour with each one, you can produce two slightly different perspectives on your idea, and it's worthwhile to experiment with both in the earlier stages. Now that's step one. So this is documenting your plan A. I talked about how that's important to avoid the rationalization trap. It's also very typical. If you are building a complex project, like say a house, even if you're an experienced builder, you would still start with some kind of an architectural sketch. You wouldn't just go out there and start putting up walls. And that's what step one is really about. So it's really document your plan A. Step two is one about prioritizing what's riskiest now in the plan. So don't just rush to build solution, which is what we all do, because that's fun, that comes easy to us, but that may not be the riskiest thing. So again, the world has changed. It used to be that building things was really hard. Now it's not, it's still hard, there's still technical problems out there, but not as hard. So we can build almost anything these days given enough time, money, effort, and thanks to the internet, cloud computing, open source software, things have become easier. So 10, 15 years ago, even getting a software license used to be a big deal. It was thousands of dollars, servers were tens of thousands of dollars. Those things aren't the case anymore. So the question now isn't can we build this thing, but rather will anyone care if we build these things? That tends to be the bigger risk. So a lot of what the second step is about is essentially playing this game of Jenga with your idea. You're not here to take out the strongest pieces, you're here to take out the weakest pieces so that the tower doesn't collapse. This also is a counterintuitive thing to internalize, and that was news to me when I first started out. I thought entrepreneurship was this risky venture. I thought all the best entrepreneurs were people who would jump off cliffs and take all this risk along with them. And I found that some of the best entrepreneurs are actually very risk averse. When they look at an idea, the first thing they want to do is remove as much risk in the business as possible. Richard Branson, when he started Virgin Airlines, negotiated a return the airlines clause after a year with Boeing. He said that if my airline fails after a year, I have the right to give you back all the planes and not lose a single dime in that process. That's a billionaire negotiating that in his contract because he's trying to remove the downside from this risky venture. So again, that's the thing to internalize of what this step is about, is take your idea and don't find what's easiest, find what's riskiest, and tackle that piece first. And then in the lean startup body of work, we've got lots of tools and techniques for removing risk or tackling risk. This is where we get a bit scientific, and we use words like hypotheses and experiments, because each of these risks essentially represents some kind of an assumption, some kind of a guess that we have. When we think we know the customer, that in itself is a hypothesis. That may be the customer, but it may not be. And so we take a scientific approach and we design an experiment. An experiment is simply something we put in front of customers to test their impact or to test their reaction to. So this is the build, measure, learn loop that Eric Ries codified a few years ago. Those of you that have seen this kind of know what that is. But just a quick walkthrough here is we take these big ideas that we have, we build something small. So we could build a partial product, we could build a landing page. We build something small, we put that in front of customers, we collect data, and that data leads to learning, which fuels the next learning loop. Now the difference here compared to traditional product development is that we do this very, very quickly. So this is no different than how we might build products in the past, because we might have one big idea, we take 6 months to build that idea out, put it in front of customers, we realize, oh, it was not the right thing. We go away for another 6 months and try again. And that doesn't get us these fast cycles, because after a year, we run out of resources and then we have nowhere to go. So a very key part here is internalizing this notion of speed. So you want to go around this loop as fast as you can learn, which means in a 6-month period, can I do 10 of these iterations, or can I do 100 of these iterations? So you want to go faster than you would normally. At the end of these loops, you want to end up in learning, but I qualify that even further. It has to be customer-based learning. It's not enough to say I build things to spec and the quality is there, because if a customer hasn't used it, then you don't quite know if the business model will follow. So it has to end in customer learning. You have to build something, you have to put it in the hands of customers, and you have to measure their reaction to it, good or bad. Even the bad ones allow us to then learn and then kind of pivot or iterate from there. And then the last piece over here is focus. So a lot of people who are lean practitioners in the room have probably run into this trap, which is this notion of just running experiments for the sake of it. You can test every aspect of your business, but not everything is going to be equally risky at the same time. So this is where the prioritization of what's riskiest is very important. So extreme examples of this might be trying to prematurely optimize your marketing or your code quality or your code performance. That may not be the most critical thing because you have no customers, you don't need that capacity yet. So those are ways to kind of think of that. Here's a simple diagram that kind of shows these three things, speed, learning, and focus, as a Venn diagram, and kind of illustrates what happens when you don't have all three cylinders firing. So if you're going very fast and you're focused, but you aren't doing customer learning, this is the image of a dog kind of chasing its tail. You're just randomly throwing stuff out there, and maybe you'll get lucky, but oftentimes without the learning, you don't quite get the guidance on what to do next. If you aren't going fast, this one is obvious. You're going to either run out of resources yourself, or you're going to prove the model just enough to where a fast follower comes and says, thank you very much, we'll take the business from here. And they reach the market before you do. So you have to be going fast. In this model, speed is very important, and we'll talk about kind of different speeds. The thing to realize is that if you can outlearn your competition, you win. It's not trying to be the fastest in the pack, you just have to be faster than your competition. And then the last piece over here, which is a very common trap to fall into, is the premature optimization trap. So this is when we're going very fast and we're learning, but we're not focused on the right things. So this is where you might be trying to optimize your quality when that's not the most important thing, or your marketing, or your build velocity when those may not be the most important things. So again, very important to kind of keep all three things in perspective as you chart your journey. So these will change with time. In the earlier stages, there are going to be different risks than there are going to be at latter stages. And so this, in many ways, is the one-page kind of summary of what running lean might look like. So it's a very iterative process. For those of you that come from a software background or an engineering background or a science background, you'll kind of see it's a very rational, more scientific approach to taking business modeling. And that's why I said it's a lot like building products, only we apply it to the business model process itself. So you start on the far left with a big idea. You deconstruct it into its component pieces. You then prioritize what's riskiest, not what's easiest. You then run these small, fast, additive experiments to inform your understanding of those risks. And then there are feedback loops. And feedback loops are what help us course correct. So the first feedback loop might tell us that our risks are not as risky as we thought, and we can mitigate them and we move on. But other times we may have to update the business model. And so this is where the feedback loops from left to right actually inform us on building the things that will actually work from an innovation perspective versus just being an invention that we want to brute force kind of out at the end of the day. So I call this the business model development process because it's very parallel to the product development process. So that's kind of that one-page summary. So what I want to do next is do some rapid-fire case studies and make this as interactive as possible so you get kind of a sense of what this process might really look like. Now, I'll do two examples here. One is going to be a low-tech and one's going to be a high-tech. And I think they will bring to light some different perspectives and challenges in each of them. And at one point, I used to try to do a number of case studies, and eventually somebody in the room will say, I can see how it worked for all the case studies you put up there, but it will never work for me because I'm different. And so at some point, I began to realize that I can't cover everyone in the room, so we're going to just start with these two, but that's where we'll have some time for Q&A, and if you have questions, feel free to ask then. You can also find me afterwards, and I'm happy to spend as much time talking with you about this. So just for perspective, a lot of this lean startup work, it has the word startup at the end, so it did come out of the startup sphere, but more recently has been applied in many places, including large companies, including government even. It also came out of the high-tech startup space, mostly software, but again, in more recent years, and these examples are not software, even though everyone uses software in some way or another today. These are not software companies, and that's because even that has changed. So these have been applied in all kinds of domains, from software to hardware, from low-tech to high-tech. Even regulated industries like medtech and fintech have been experimenting with these techniques. So happy to address any of those questions when we get to that point. So I'll start with a very simple example. Let's say you're opening a restaurant. So a lot of restaurateurs, I argue, are like entrepreneurs in that they have a vision of what they want to build. So you might have done thrown a party in your house, and people said, the food's really good, you should go start a restaurant. And then we start fantasizing with that idea. And so we do all the planning. The restaurateur has probably picked out the menu already, has picked out the silverware, has picked out the location. All they need is someone to give them, write them a big fat check, and they can be in business. And so they spend all this time then pitching, which was in this case, not the build first, but the investor first approach. And oftentimes that doesn't go very well unless you have a track record. And a lot of you know the story. You have to kind of be able to convince an investor that this will be a viable business, which is hard to do when you don't have anything to show. If we were to take the running lean approach, the question to really ask ourselves is not how do I build a compelling story and go pitch it, but rather how can I show traction? How can I start with my riskiest assumption and tackle that first? So I know we have mics around, but we can just shout this out. If maybe any of you have some suggestions for what might be some of the riskier things to tackle if you were starting a restaurant or a food business? Sorry, what? Location, okay. Anyone else? The customer doesn't like what you have, okay. What else? Regulations, okay. Competition. Sure. So all these are great, and I'll tackle the first one. So location is one of those which it's like the funding one. I can show you good restaurants in bad locations and vice versa, and bad restaurants in very good locations, and sure, they may not last very long. But I look at location as one of those things that maybe it's a premature optimization to start because it may not be a guarantee that you'll be successful. But I like the suggestion of the menu and the food. If you look at a food business, fundamentally people have choices. In this part of the world, people probably do go hungry, but a lot of people in this room have choices. If you're hungry, you can go and pick where you go eat. And so the first question to really ask yourself is, if I were to take my concept, what's going to be different about it? People are already buying food. They're already hiring food for a particular job, whether it's a fancy restaurant job or it's just filling yourself when you're in a hurry. There's some reason why you're consuming this food. If you were to come up with a new concept, what makes you think you're going to be different? So kind of thinking about that risk is one way to start. But more importantly, what I want to talk about here with this example is what to do about it. So it's great that you've got this risk of, I need to make sure my food can be eaten not once but repeatedly, and I can also monetize that. Those are kind of things fundamentally to ask yourself. But you don't need to open a brick and mortar location to actually test that out. So in Austin, where I live, we have a innovation called the lean food truck, or just the food truck, I would say, where a lot of high-end restaurateurs are doing exactly that. So in the past, food trucks were relegated to cheap street food, but now you can actually go into these trailer parks in Austin where you find high-end restaurateurs kind of parked in there. You can have a 3-course meal just by going and sampling some of their foods. Now, it didn't start out that way, of course. There was usually at the beginning, there was just one. This is actually one of the first food trucks in Austin. As you can tell, it's a cupcake place. So the owners didn't have the money to open a brick and mortar location, so they created one of these food trucks and drove it around town, sold some cupcakes, and there were 2 of these food trucks, and then there were 5 brick and mortar locations. The nice thing with a food truck is that it's mobile, so you can test location. This company in particular actually started with a concept, and just so for context, I come from Austin, Texas, and so in Texas, barbecue and tacos are big, and so this was definitely an innovation in that space. So they added a fusion concept, Korean barbecue tacos, and was trying to experiment with it. But they went out and used the food truck to their advantage. So they used social media and the food truck. They went out every day and changed their location and tweeted where they were. And based on where they got the most engagement, that's where they ended up building their brick and mortar locations. So again, the nice thing with a food truck is that you don't have to invest in too heavily. Nowadays, you can rent one of these things. The MVP, the minimum viable product for food, for the restaurant business is food, which is a few hours of cooking. You can cook something up and with mobile payments, go and try to monetize that every single day. And until you can sell enough of your food, you don't quite have an idea that's worthy of a brick and mortar location. And that's what a lot of these restaurateurs that did. This by far is one of my kind of best stories because it's kind of a rags to riches story, literally. So the couple pictured here in the front are married. They were 2 starving artists, kind of below the poverty line. The person on the right, Aaron Franklin, wanted to start this barbecue business because he wanted to make enough money to support his artwork. And so he kind of managed to scrape enough to buy one of these trailers, not even a food truck, it's just a food trailer that you drag behind another truck. And he got a friend to give him an empty parking lot beside an abandoned gas station. So it was a horrible location under a highway somewhere. So unless you knew where this place was, you were not going to find it. But again, in Texas, barbecue is big. When he launched, word got out that his barbecue was so good that this began to happen, right? So the line started forming, and there was actually nobody in the store even. So if you kind of look behind, there's someone taking a picture of the line, but the store isn't open for business. And this began to happen just 2 weeks after they opened and hasn't let up since. After a while, because they couldn't make enough food, they had to turn people away. So they went and started counting people and said, everyone behind this person may not get any food, so please go home, come back tomorrow. And that hasn't stopped to this day. So now they have a much bigger location, but they still have lines that start out 2-3 hours before they open because the meat itself takes 12, 13 hours to cook, but in 2 hours it's gone. So if you're not there early, you're not going to get any food. So these guys have been very successful, but this again goes to the point where location may not be the most important thing. You really have to understand who your customer is, and you have to build something compelling for them, something for them to care about. Now, surely when things like this begin to happen, it draws other attention. So some of you might know who this person is. This is Anthony Bourdain. He's on some of the popular food TV shows. So he paid Aaron Franklin a visit. And sure enough, he gave them a rave review. He liked the food. The next thing you know, Aaron Franklin is winning a prestigious food award. He becomes a celebrity chef. He starts writing a book. He has a YouTube channel. He eventually gets a TV show. He has been he has done some cameo appearances in Hollywood movies. If you've seen the movie The Chef, where there's a food truck in it, he actually has a cameo appearance in there. So he went from being this starving artist that nobody knew about to being this celebrity chef because of this food truck that he started. And of course, now he has a brick and mortar location. Even former President Obama came to pay him a visit when he was in Austin the last time. Of course, he didn't have to stand in lines. His escorts just got him to the front. But he didn't get away without paying, which he wasn't, as you can see, too happy about here in this picture. But that just goes to show that even though you are serving the president, you still have to monetize your business. And so again, what I like about this example, again, is that by starting with the riskiest assumption, you can begin to test things that are more fundamental. A business model is fundamentally about creating value for your customers and then finding ways to deliver that value. So in this case, value is created, obviously, by creating something tasty and good that people will want to consume, but the delivery doesn't have to be the finished product. It doesn't have to be a brick and mortar location. It could be this temporary thing, the food truck. Although, funny enough, many of these restaurateurs have kept their food trucks around. So even though they have graduated to brick and mortar locations, the food truck is still where they can innovate very quickly. So they actually segment their audience by the foodies who are the early adopters that want to try cutting edge stuff, who will still be willing to experiment with them, and that's where they test their new menu items. And then the brick and mortar locations are for the more established menu items that have worked in the past. And so this way, every single day or every single week, they can still continue to experiment with their recipes, with their menu items, and only when something works in the food truck do they then graduate it to their restaurant, which it's more expensive. It takes more time to get it in there. So that's a way to kind of think of, in the lean world, we sometimes talk about continuous deployment or continuous delivery. This is a way of how to do this with food, is you can actually have two ways of delivering value to your customers, one in your restaurants, one with a food truck or some other alternative. One gives you faster feedback, and you can course correct along the way, and the other is more for scale and for profit. So that's kind of what I like about this example. It begins to illustrate how you can do these things even with a low-tech example like food. So now we'll go really high-tech. So a lot of you, even though I've cut off Elon Musk here in half, can probably recognize him in Tesla. And so this is an example of a much bigger idea. It is a hardware product, a physical product. It's also building a car, which is a highly regulated industry. So how do you really succeed in something like that? So again, I'll go back, and many of you know probably the story or have kind of followed the story to some extent. But I'll go back to, if you were Elon Musk and starting Tesla, what would be some of the riskiest things you would want to tackle first? Anyone? There's charging stations, okay? So again, maybe I'll kind of jump in on that one. So charging stations, of course, very important, but what if you don't sell any cars? Like, is it the riskiest thing today? It's a bit like the location, is that I want the best location for my restaurant, but if nobody likes my restaurant, why should I pay a premium for that good a location? So if I start building charging stations now, but I haven't sold a single car, that may be an example of prematurely trying to optimize for that problem. So maybe something more fundamental. Desire for the car, but then get a bit more into like what about it. So again, think of the food example where people have choices. So these guys weren't inventing cars. Cars were already out there. They were petrol powered. So what was wrong with petrol powered cars that would make people want to switch? And what would they have to be able to do to make them switch? Manufacturing costs, okay. Synthetic fuel, okay. Performance, competition, okay. So I'll kind of move this along. So let's go back to something fundamental. So let's go into a buying position. So let's say that I was Elon Musk and I say buy my electric car, get rid of your petrol powered vehicle, and you say why? And I say, well, because it's green, it's better for the environment. Gas prices at that time were going up, and now they were down, but they're up again. So those may be a reason why. And so again, we knew that hybrids were selling, so that was a compelling reason to make you want to switch. But your next question to me is, well, I know these hybrid cars are out there. Why is your car that much different or better? And I tell you, it's all electric. It doesn't have any petrol whatsoever. And then you ask me the obvious next question, which is how far does it go before it needs a charge? And I tell you 30 kilometers. And that's an immediate no-go. No one's going to buy a car that can only go 30 kilometers and then require a recharge. So if I can't solve that problem, that became their riskiest problem to solve. And there was a term for it. It was called range anxiety. Is that if people feel like they're going to be stranded on their way to work or on their way back, they're not going to buy this car. And so you had to overcome that. And so Tesla made a bold kind of decision to really invest in solving that problem first. Is if they didn't solve for range anxiety, it didn't matter how fast that car went or how cheap or expensive it was, no one would buy it because it would not be usable, it would not be practical, it would be a toy project. So that became their initial risky assumption to go test, and so they quickly realized that they were in the business of building a battery, not a car. And if you're building a battery and innovating on the battery and not a car, why even build a car? And if you've seen kind of the first car that Tesla put out there, this is the Roadster that they didn't build. This is actually a model that they licensed from Lotus, so a highly desirable sports car. They went to Lotus and said, we're building this all-electric car. Can we buy the rights for your design and your body where we can take out its guts and put in our battery and sell it as our own? And sure enough, they agreed, probably at a very hefty price tag. And the point here is that by doing this, it was not so much about profit. So someone mentioned manufacturing costs. It was really more fundamental than that. It was, can we actually build an electric car and get people to buy it in the first place? And if they wouldn't buy that, then why should we mass produce this? Why should we worry about electric chargers and all of those types of things? The next obvious question, though, is why did they start with the Lotus? So if you've heard Tesla, their vision all along was to build an all-affordable electric car. $35,000 price point was their target. The Lotus is the opposite of that. It's a very expensive sports car. So why start there? Or why go after them? Why not go after a Volkswagen or a Kia or something more accessible? Any thoughts? Parking? Marketing, okay. So yeah, so one of the differentiators that they came out with is that electric doesn't have to be slow. If you see a lot of, if anyone has hybrids here, I don't want to insult the speed of the performance of the car, but a lot of the impressions were that these cars don't go as fast, while here Tesla comes along and says electric doesn't have to be slow. So it definitely helped with positioning and marketing and got attention. So your value proposition has to pop, and they certainly did that with that car. But even then, this is one of the most expensive sports cars, not maybe at the top line, but there are much cheaper ones. You could go with a Ford Mustang, you could go with a Miata or something. You didn't have to go all the way to like a Lotus. So why still go that high in price?
Smaller market sample, so it's easier to see if you can have an impact. You're selling to a market where it's only market size of 1,000.
Sure.
Sell 100, there's a percentage-wise you can make an impact on that market. Harder to do in a mass market.
Okay, yes, I can see that. Okay, and maybe I'll throw out some of these answers. Not everyone can hear, but so there was a question about kind of the early adopter choice, making sure, and then there was also the suggestion about penetrating a smaller market versus and showing penetration and percentages adoption. I mean, and all those are great, but if I ask the question slightly differently, what happens to demand when prices go up? Demand typically drops. And that was a very conscious strategy that Tesla was playing, because if they had gone out there and they said, we have built this amazing battery which can go 200 kilometers, which was 200 miles was their goal, so maybe a little more than 200 kilometers, will you buy $35,000? We can put it in a car and sell it to you for $35,000. There would be maybe not as much demand as there was 2 months ago, but there still would be a lot of demand. And with that demand, as an entrepreneur, you have to step up to it. So you'd have to worry about your factories, you'd have to worry about building this car, supporting this car, charging infrastructures. Everything comes at you at once. And when I say focus on your riskiest assumption, you wouldn't be able to control that because the demand will just take you everywhere. So they created a deliberate strategy, which Elon Musk blogged about in 2006, which was a three-part strategy, which is start with a really expensive sports car, sell it to his kind of rich friends and people he could pick up the phone and get them on. Now, when you're buying an expensive sports car like this one, chances are high this is not your primary vehicle. You probably have another car in the garage as well. And you're buying this because you buy into the idea and you're, by definition, an early adopter. So that's what they were really playing up. By doing that, they could prove they could sell this car, but they were really trying to test their assumptions on whether the car would work. Would it catch fire? One of them actually did catch fire, which they fixed. But thankfully, with an early adopter, so it was not that big of a PR mess. So they were able to kind of fix the problem without much backlash. Give them a new car. And many of these people, and at this point, they had no idea how long these cars would take them to build. I know a few investor types that wrote them $100,000 checks as down payment for this car, and they waited 3 years for delivery with no expectation of ever seeing that car. So again, those were the kind of people that Elon Musk sold the car to in the beginning, but it was to test those assumptions, which is we have built this car, can we actually put it in a vehicle and sell it without investing too heavily, again, in the downside? So had they gone and built factories, had they gone and built charging stations, and the battery didn't work and the car exploded, that would have all been kind of a bad overinvestment at that time. So that was their stage one, and that's why they picked a really expensive sports car, but that wasn't their end game. So they had two more stages. The Model S, which came afterwards, was their attempt to build their own car, and it did very well for them. But this is when, after the success of the battery with the Roadster, they said, we need to get good at building our own cars because we can't keep paying Lotus licenses and make any money doing it. The business model wouldn't work. So they actually went and started hiring automotive engineers. They went and got a factory as investment from Toyota, and they started building these Model S's. But even then, they were capping demand. They were only building so many of these, and you had to be kind of first in queue to get them. They were not cheap either, so they were not as expensive as the Roadster. They were still expensive, so demand was still not through the roof. And they used this to actually get very good at building cars. Those of you that know things about the Tesla, they had over-the-wire updates, so they were able to change the configuration of the car without kind of shipping you new parts. They were able to add all these features and really iterate with the concept to where they are today. And now they've gone out and really opened this up. So 2 months ago, 3 months ago maybe, they announced the Model 3, which was the $35,000 price point target that they had many years ago. And in 48 hours, they had 200,000 orders. And of course, the big question now is, can they actually deliver on all those promises? And they have deliveries that have been queued up. These are advance payments for deliveries that are 2-3 years, maybe 2.5 years out from when they were taken. But again, the point of this case study here, it illustrates a lot of the things from earlier, with the start with what's riskiest, but it really gives you perspective on how not to worry about scaling issues day one. Too many entrepreneurs and too many big companies even try to worry about what's going to happen at scale. We should be so lucky to have those problems someday. So what you want to instead do is, again, figure out who your customers are, how do you get your product in their hands, and whatever they're using out of their hands. That's usually the first challenge to begin with. So how do you create value for your customers? Don't forget about the delivery. Don't obsess about the delivery mechanism just yet. It may not be profitable, it may not be optimized, but that is the first assumption you have to really test. If you can do that, it then gives you permission to then scale up accordingly. And Tesla is a great story. It's similar to the food truck example, except this is a much bigger scale. This is working with a regulated industry, a physical product, and it's using a staged rollout model, not with one product, but with 3 different products, each of them that were built and were successful. One of them that is no longer with us, the Roadster, is no longer being built because it didn't fit the business model goal. And so after they learned from it, they got rid of it. So there are still Roadsters around, but those are kind of trophy cars that people still have. But no one's really buying those, or there's no new cars being built. So the way to kind of internalize those stages is by thinking of it this way. So there are 3 stages that I describe in the books. The first one is problem, solution, fit. And the questions we really want to ask ourselves here is, do we really have a big enough problem worth solving? The counterintuitive principle is that you don't need to actually build a product first. Even Tesla, before they built their car, they had been working on the battery. They shared the concept of the car, and they got people on phones to say, if you build this, I will buy. So they took all these advanced payments from the early adopters without having a shippable, workable car. This is where your early adopters come into play, and there are lots of techniques we can get into on how to do this. For many of you, this could be landing pages, could be prototypes, could be just demos, or could be working prototypes, but doesn't have to be a fully optimized working product. Because if you can't get customers to say, this is what I want, if you can't create an offer that's accepted, then you don't have permission to go build this thing just yet. So that's usually the first thing we try to tackle. When you enter stage 2, this is the product market fit stage. This is when you start out with the minimum viable product. Now, there's an art to figuring out what is truly minimum viable in that product. But once you can build that out, it doesn't end there. So like in the Tesla story, like in the food truck story, there's going to be lots of refinements and iterations. But the counterintuitive principle here is that you don't have to go to scale either to test your business model working. Facebook is a great example of this. So Facebook launched in Harvard, which was, again, even though it was a massive school, it was just one school. So they had to show repeatability. They went to 3 other Ivy League schools and showed that Facebook could work there. And that was enough. With that much evidence, even though their competitors had millions of users and millions of dollars in funding, Facebook was able to go and command twice the valuation as their closest competitors, because with just 4 colleges, they were able to show metrics that could be extrapolated to something much, much bigger. And that's the point here, is that you can prove out your business model in micro scale. You don't have to go all the way to the nth level to show the business model working. By that point, it's too late. Your investors want to get in kind of on the ground floor. So again, focus more on repeatability, which is what the third piece is about, is that once you can establish product market fit, there's a shift in strategy where it's less about making the product better and more about growth, which are 2 different things. So you start to look not for customer value creation because you've created enough value. The trap many innovators fall into is they continually try to keep creating more and more value, which may not be the best approach, because when you hit scale, you have to now look for your engines of growth. Now here, too many people try to get to scale prematurely. So this is where you have to be confident that what you have built truly is delivering and capturing value, and what you're trying to do now is scale that up. So in the food truck example, I know my food is good. I know these lines, the food is selling out every day. That's when I start pursuing scale, not when when I have leftovers and when my food isn't moving as quickly as I want to. So that, hopefully these 2 case studies give you some perspective on how this can be applied. Before we kind of end and take questions, I'll show you a different perspective. So I shared with you this 3-part process for developing your business model. This is more of a timeline or a life cycle view. So in this picture, I'm showing not one canvas in your document, your plan A, but multiple. And the reason we do this is that if you start with just one idea and one possible implementation of it, you can fall into what we call the local maxima trap. Those of you that are engineers or mathematics majors know exactly what this is, or computer science. But for everyone else, I'll kind of illustrate it with a metaphor. So imagine you're blindfolded and you're given the task to find the highest point in this landscape. If you land somewhere in the bottom there, you might stumble your way, because actually remember you have a blindfold, so you can't really see very well. So you might stumble your way up to a hill and declare that to be the highest point, because everywhere else would be lower. But when you take off the blindfold, you find a neighboring mountain next to you. The same thing happens to us with our ideas, is if you rush towards building a solution or rush towards a single lean canvas, a single business model, you can fall into a local maximum. So what you want to instead do at this stage is remember the Lego analogy, is play with your business model, take a step back and ask a bunch of what-if questions. What if you could change the problem up, or you could change the customer segment up? Could you create an alternative model that could be much, much bigger? And so the idea here is to really do some brainstorming. Some of these ideas will be outright silly or not practical, and you could rule them out on the spot. But you could have a short list of multiple ideas that you can test in parallel. And that's the point here. So for each of those shortlisted ideas, you would identify what's riskiest, and then you go through this systematic process of the 3 stages I talked about, and you will notice a narrowing down effect. So again, nothing wrong with casting a wider net, because just like we don't quite know what our customers want, we don't quite know which business model is going to work in its earliest stages. And so you need to cast a wide net and really split test your business models against each other, and eventually you're going to double down and take one of them all the way to scale. Now, my job is to get you here, or at least help you get here as best as I can. And once you get here, of course, you have options. You can go back to some of your older ideas and revive them, but again, those are good problems to have. But this is kind of how the life cycle of the canvassing process, the business modeling process applied with Lean will typically look like. And so the mindset here to internalize is this idea of search versus execution. At least those of you that are on the earlier stages, I would advise you to start searching for alternatives. Don't get into this mindset of, I need to execute this one idea that I have. Look for these variants, because there can be some very interesting business models that present itself. Those of you that are also at product market fit, there are still opportunities for resegmenting, narrowing down. Oftentimes, as we add customers, we think things get clearer. My experience has been things get murkier, because you thought you were targeting one customer type, but now you're serving 5 of them. Like, are those the real, is your business model going to serve 5, or do you need to narrow down back to 1? So again, you can do a lot of this type of thinking to really search for the most viable way to grow and kind of double down on a few segments versus trying to do everything for everyone. So one final takeaway. I know we, as entrepreneurs, pay a lot of lip service to perseverance and grit, and I would say those are very important qualities, because this stuff is hard. It's hard because you don't get a lot of positive signals along the way. At the same time, I would say that perseverance and grit can get you only so far if you are trying to brute force a solution. Because, as I said before, good ideas are rare and hard to find. If you're just trying to brute force a solution that's not going to work, you can, with perseverance, delay the time it's going to take you to kill your idea, but one day you're going to have to kill it. So we want to avoid kind of that bad news there. So I often kind of look at it differently. So if you think of your solution as a key without a door, that's a much healthier way to think about it. If you start by building a solution without knowing what door it's going to open, you build this thing out and then you start searching for doors, and maybe you get lucky. But a much more better approach, or viable approach, and the one that I'm advocating here, is really starting with problems first. So if you start with the doors that you want to get open, as entrepreneurs, we are very good at key building. So if you start with the problems and the customers, we can actually build keys to doors that take us places. And hopefully that serves you well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ash. That was a real tour de force. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you put your hand up again, somebody will come to you with a microphone, and just wait for the mic to ask your question. So I can see one down there on my left-hand side. If we can get a mic down there. There's one coming around now. Okay, that wasn't the jet, but go ahead. You've got the mic.
Hello.
Yep, can I hear you?
Hi everyone, Robbie here from Fitometrics, and thank you, Ash, for a great talk. I'm familiar with your ideas, and they've very much helped me in the past. But the question I had was, you mentioned at the start of the talk that to concentrate on speed, and like the diagram, the Venn diagram,
Sure.
of the focus, speed, and learning. When I've tried this in the past, I've come up against kind of an issue: how fast is fast? And I know it's probably how long is a piece of string, but is there any sort of benchmarks that you can give us?
Yeah, so I get into that question a lot, where people will compare their speed against the fastest of the fastest. So if you go into places, people doing software, Facebook, Silicon Valley, people are pushing 50, 60 releases sometimes a day, and that's how fast one can possibly go. And so, of course, they have got scale on their side. They've got software and things that can be changed very quickly. And I don't think the answer is, let me go as fast as I possibly can. You really want to ask yourself, am I going faster than the alternative? And that's the key thing. So if you look at the Tesla example, they took years to still build out the battery and build out their first car, but compared to other car manufacturers, they were going at light speed, and they still are. So that's what I would really look at, is that when you look at benchmarks, you can go super fast, like in the, as I said, in the software and Facebook or those type of company examples. And if you can get to that speed, great. But the only thing that I would say is that look at what you're doing today and try to increasingly speed up and don't go faster than you can learn, because the trap also is people just start going really fast without getting the right metrics and the right data coming back. And then again, you are just spinning wheels. You're just kind of throwing stuff out there and hoping it works, and that's not, again, the approach you want to take. So go as fast as you possibly can learn, but be cognizant of your kind of domain and your industry as well.
Thank you for that question. And so yes, that gentleman with his hand up there, yeah, there's a microphone coming to you now.
Thanks again, Ash. Out here from Meet Hero. I was just wondering about, like with new products and that, where you come up against patenting and first to market, and that can be a bit of a headache of what decision you'd make. Do you come across that yourself? Or?
Yeah, a lot. So I'll address first to market. So in the Lean Canvas, there's an unfair advantage box, and I can't tell you how many times I see first to market in there, and then I quickly list out a bunch of companies, including Google, Microsoft, Toyota, Ford. None of these were really first in their respective market. We can add Facebook in there. They were not first in their markets. They were actually all fast followers in the market. They didn't invent the things that we know them for. They actually just built those business model innovations that really led to making the business work. And so I'll often counter-argue that being truly first is not an unfair advantage, but rather an unfair disadvantage, because not only are you trying to be first and prove out something which is hard with customers, but you're also trying to kind of invent and be on that leading front. So I look at it differently. I'm not saying that there are no advantages of being first, but it's not so much first to market as in I launched first, but first to market share. So if you can get your product in the hands of customers, and then you can continue the pace where you can outlearn competition, you build the right relationships with them, that becomes a sustaining position. And even that can be quickly, as we see kind of how companies are getting disrupted these days, even that is not a given, but at least it gives you a much stronger ground to maybe see things before your competitors do and react to them before your competitors do, because that is what's going to happen.
Okay, so we've got time for another 2 or 3 questions. I've got one over here.
Thank you, Ash. Richard Pike from Governor. I see this in a B2C world where individuals can make decisions and give you time and money and feedback. In a B2B world, particularly to large companies, it tends to be difficult because, number one, they can't or won't interact with startups or small companies, and they also don't have the time, to take the time to test your product,
Yep.
to play out with it. How do you see that working in that sense?
Sure. So this has been applied in many B2B cases, but I would say that the first thing to kind of keep in mind is that in a B2C environment, typically your minimum viable product is getting something to consumers, which, as you point out, you can do rather quickly, and you can launch and you can control the sizes of who you launch to, because a lot of that traffic is self-serve, comes over the web maybe. In a B2B world, the initial product is not even the product you build, but it's really the offer. I call it the sales process. That's really what you're trying to figure out. So if I work with a team that's trying to sell to the enterprise, I want to look in their canvas to see what are their channels today. Like, can they actually pick up the phone and even go and talk to these B2B customers? Because if not, that could be risk number one. Maybe they need to get some advisors on board or a team member who can open those doors for them. Because if you can't talk to your customers, you can't sell them anything, even if you've got something to sell. But assuming that you can actually do that, can you actually set up the meeting with a value proposition? If you can nail a problem, and this is the part that is very key, is that if you can nail a customer's problem, something they are running up against repeatedly, they will take a call with you. If it's not something that's top of mind, they are going to push it off, or you're going to be talking to the wrong people. And that ultimately is a test, because a lot of innovation is not really about doing things slightly better than what's already in place, but creating leaps and bounds. And some people would talk about 2x, 3x, even 10x types of improvements. So if I go to the right person in a B2B environment and said, look, I'm trying to do something in this space, in this problem space, and here's what I can potentially do. Don't even get into the solution, just get into the value proposition. If that doesn't get you a call, then again, building that's not going to get you a call either. So in the initial phases, when we talk about problem solution fit, we're trying to get to the offer, which is what can I tell my B2B clients to get me the right meetings? What can I now show them, and this is the art of the demo, to convince them that I can actually create this outcome for them. And if they need to then de-risk that with the pilot, they would be willing to at least take those appropriate next steps. But if not, if none of those first two steps check out, then the pilot's not going to work either. And so as far as the last part of the iterations, if you do bring in early adopter companies, there are ways to limit pilots and limit rollouts, and you can still do some of these iterative stuff, maybe not, again, as fast as a B2C startup, but again, remember, it's going faster than what you normally would do, which would be, let's go and do a big vision, a big roadmap, do a top-down sale, get this to everyone, and that is usually a longer way to get to the same, kind of the same ends.
Great, and we can take one more question, and I'm conscious this side of the room is leading 3-0. So are there any questions on this side of the room? Yes, one here.
Hi, Ash. That talk was brilliant. I'm Louise from gliss.com, and I just want to know, in terms of your business model canvas, how do you suggest using that when you are dealing with a marketplace business? So you are solving two problems.
Yes. Yeah, in some ways you answered your own question. When you're solving two sides, you have to create two canvases. And unfortunately, even though marketplaces are very popular, if you are building one of those, my sympathies, because it is one of the harder ones to crack, simply because there's two of everything. And so even in a multi-sided model like Facebook, there's two of everything. You have customers and users, but you can focus on one side. So if you were building the next Facebook, you would want to show lots of traction with your users, and then the advertisers will follow. But in a marketplace, it's buyers and sellers. But there is some good news, is as with everything, if you narrow down, if you figure out what are people wanting to buy and sell, how are they doing that today, if you can figure out the early adopters like Uber did with people looking for taxis and where they might be, and finding the early adopters on the buyer side and the seller side, there are ways to reduce the complexity. But the short answer is you'll have two canvases and two of everything, two sets of metrics as well, the buyer side and the seller side. Sure.
Great, thank you so much. Please give a warm round of applause to Ash.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ash.